Do you want to put this on?
Yeah. This, do you know, I think presenter.
Turn it on. It feels so hot. Does that feel better? Can people hear me? Testing. Testing. Hello, hello. Grace and peace to you.
I can't stay at a meeting, but we'll give her a speaker a hug. How are you? I know we're not supposed to do that in the middle of a pandemic, but it's good to see you.
It's good to see
All
you.
right.
I'm
Thanks
all
for being
vaccinated, and I'm sure you are as well.
Okay, Adam, so I'll have you wear that.
This, and this goes.
We'll use this if people have questions. But I will, is this on? Yep. Okay. Is the television on?
All right. Devil's in the details.
I assume you're going to have all the answers.
If I'm successful, you'll leave here hopelessly confused.
I'm going to go ahead and introduce you.
Okay.
I really miss Rebecca this morning, so I hope she is having a great time serving Christ in St. John's. We welcome you to Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church this morning as we continue our month-long adult education series on Israel and Palestine. Those who are joining us via live stream should be able to find a PDF file of the presentation for this morning on the live stream page. Because of technological limitations, we aren't able to properly display through our sanctuary cameras information on the TV screen. Before I introduce Adam Kessler, our speaker for this morning, I would like to invite you to attend the rest of the speakers in this series. On October 17th, Saeed Achan, professor of peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College, will speak from his experience as a Palestinian and his work studying the Palestinian experience. On October 24th, Christian peacemaker teams will share with us about their peacemaking work in Hebron. On October 31st, we will have an update on our choir tour scheduled for the summer of 2022, traveling to the Middle East. And our author and journalist Yossi Klein Halevi, the author of Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, will join us on October 18th at 7 p.m. at Mainline Reformed Temple as our community forum speaker. This event is free to the public, but we are requiring pre-registration, and you can find that link on our website. And now a word of welcome on this morning's speaker. Adam Kessler is the past director of the Jewish Community Relations Council, the JCRC, of the Jewish Federation of Greater Philadelphia, where he served for over a decade. The JCRC is dedicated to improving intergroup understanding and serves as a common table for public policy debate among and for the Jewish community. Adam is currently working with local Christian and Jewish leaders by building support for peace-building programs that serve Palestinians and Israelis. Adam serves on the boards of Zones of Peace, a region-wide interfaith movement which addresses the root causes of violence in our community, Ceasefire PA, a statewide organization advocating and educating to find common-sense solutions to gun violence, the Institute for Jewish Catholic Relations at St. Joseph's University, which seeks to increase and deepen understanding between the two communities, and the Carol Landis Foundation, a philanthropic nonprofit which provides financial support to social justice causes and organizations in the Philadelphia region. Most recently, he joined the board of Jewish Family and Children's Services of Greater Philadelphia, which provides social services to those in need. He is a member of Congregation Beth Or in Maple Glen. Adam, welcome to Bryn Mawr Presbyterian Church.
Thank you very much.
We hear you gladly this day.
I'm coming in loud and clear. Okay, thanks everybody. It's good to be here. It's nice to actually put on some dress clothes for a change. I don't think I've done anything in person in a long time, so good to see you all here and whoever else is joining us online. So I have a difficult task. I think that what I'd like to try to cover is enough material for a 15-week college course, doing 3-hour lectures each week. So what I wanted to do, especially as a run-up to Yossi Klein Halevi's presentation, which I urge you to listen to or to attend if you can, is to just try to frame the complexity of this issue, Israel-Palestine. I have my own biases, but I also am going to try very hard to sort of complicate it for you. If you think you're going to leave here having all the answers, I'm sorry to disappoint. You will leave here scratching your head. In fact, this mantra, it's complicated. One of the things that we used to do in JCRC trips to Israel with your pastor and many others in the Philadelphia community, people would say, why are we going to Israel? And we would tell them just that. It's to create a layer of complexity so that when we make decisions about peace and we guide our churches and our synagogues to get involved in that effort, they do so with a deeper understanding. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of my general assumptions for a second. So most of us have a very simple understanding of many complex issues. Let's face it. Doesn't matter what the topic. We hear something on television, we read an article, and we know that to get to the root of those of what's behind it takes a lot of effort and time that many of us just don't have. Also, especially today, with 24/7 news, social media, etc., the debate tends to be controlled by the extremes on both sides, and I think that skews our understanding of things. I like to say that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is complicated. It's a struggle between right and wrong and wrong. In other words, both sides say things that they deeply believe, and either, whether it's right or it's wrong, sometimes, from my perspective, is not necessarily that important. I mean, I have felt, as somebody who left, I'm no longer working at the JCRC, so I'm free and unencumbered here, and I believe that the path to peace comes from recognizing the history and learning from the history, but not to dwell on it. Having said that, we're going to talk a little bit about the history because I want you to understand from whence we all come. And finally, I would just say that another general assumption is that peace can happen, and people like yourselves, churches and communities can do a lot to help with that effort because they can help build the trust between Israelis and Palestinians, not just for Israelis and not just for Palestinians, but both. Just have to tell you how gratified I am that the technology is working. Thank you. Continuing with some general assumptions. Israel is one of the most wonderful success stories, one of the really great liberal democracy stories that I think we can speak to. At the same time, Palestinians are being oppressed and suffer, particularly in Gaza. Israelis see themselves as a David, and not as a Goliath. I think that's a general misconception that people have, and it guides Israel in how they conduct themselves. Palestinians suffer from powerlessness and victimization. The history of Palestinian Arabs is one of subjugation, being used and abused by a number of countries, including Britain, including Israel, and it's perfectly understandable why they think that the way they do. I personally believe right now that a majority of Israelis want peace deep in their hearts, but they're not sure that the Arabs can deliver. I believe that many Palestinians also want peace. Most Palestinians want to live and let live. They want to go to work, they want to have a sense of equality, but unfortunately there are those very vocal in the Arab community who see Israel as a colonialist, non-Muslim Western colonialist power, and they will not accept them. So let's look at some of the key historical arguments, the connection to the land. Normally in a smaller room, what I ask people to do is I ask a volunteer to read some of this, but I'm not sure that people will be heard, because I just think that what I try to convey is a sense of a deep feeling that each side has about some of these arguments. So because of the forum that we have and the limited amount of time, I'm just going to sort of paraphrase and say that the connection that Jews have for the land of Israel is something that's been it's been written about and discussed for 4,000 years. The Palestinians have a different connection to the land. It's more recent, but no less legitimate. And the fact of the matter is that neither of these two sides tend to recognize each other in those realities. Jews, especially in the early part of the last century, and I say it in red, the Arabs of Palestine were not a national group and never have been. So there was often, and even in my community, an attempt to create the justification, almost in legal standpoint, of who had the right to the land. And you see the Palestinians would have said, the ancestors of today's Palestinians were there before the Israelites. So this kind of thing went back and forth. And until we get to the sort of the legal claim, I want to just say, hold on. This is sorry. Just not sure what happened. Well, I lost it. I'm not sure what happened. Maybe you can just see if we can figure out. I thought this would be. Not sure what I did. Oh, that's a shame. Yeah.
You talk for a second.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So I think that what I wanted to talk about was the legal claim that comes up next with Israel, in the sense that in 1917 the Balfour Declaration is offered by the British. The British recognize what's happening in the Middle East. They also come out of World War I, and they wanted to connect. They wanted to have legitimate claims to that part of the world. So they started. So the British made promises to both the Arabs and to the Jews, and for many reasons, many very detailed reasons. Thank you. They were unable to fulfill those promises to the Arabs, and they made a promise to both. I just wanted to show you this. They made a promise to both the Jews in the Balfour Declaration, and a promise earlier on to the Arabs. The promise to the Arabs was simply not kept. Then you have in the 20s and 30s, as immigration increases, you have pogroms or riots against the Jews in Russia. and you have a huge influx of immigrants coming into Russia, coming from Russia and Poland to Israel, and of course the Arabs are resisting this. They are also starting to recognize that they have a nationalist movement, just like the Jews do. Jews have Zionism. There's also Arab nationalism. So these two things start to conflict. And they start competing with the British for primacy. There were...
Did you press a button to get that on there? When you plugged it in?
Yeah. You know what, we'll just... that's a shame. See, I wish to... I was...
Yeah, I got it.
You got back? Okay, good. Good, thank you. This is... Sorry about this, folks. Yeah, so we'll just fast track this to the immigration and the violence that took place. So the British backed the Zionists, and these disturbances, and they punished Palestinians harshly and illegitimately. This was the perspective of the Palestinians. The Israelis, or the Jews at the time, were looking for a state. The Peel Commission is created, and then it's all sort of sidetracked by the war. After the war, you have UN resolution in 1947, which is created because the British said, we're finished with the British mandate. We can't manage these two nations that are competing for a country, and we have a war of independence in 1948 after Israel is declared a country. All along, you have several options that are put on the table to create states. There was an appeal commission in the 30s. Then you had the 1947 partition, and again with the creation of the state, in which a state was offered, and these are rejected by the Arab community and accepted by the Jewish community. Now, the problem is that we now get into a very foggy section of history, and even from the kinds of things that I've learned as growing up and things that I've learned today. The reality is that the argument for years was that, as you see, the refugee issue was artificially kept alive by the Arab states. There's some truth to that. They used the refugees as pawns against Israel. Especially in that time, there is the understanding that Arabs are simply not willing ever to accept Jews, Westerners in their midst. So instead, the Arabs Israel has repeatedly offered peace and had these things rejected. The Palestinians, on the other hand, are become pawns of the Arab states who have also refused to absorb refugees, which happened also. There were also refugees from Arab states, and those Jews were absorbed into Israel. You didn't see that happening on the other side. So these kinds of arguments have prevailed inside of these two communities for quite a long time. I wanted to also talk a little bit about some of the differences of opinions that we have in our own communities between Jews and Christians, and why sometimes we don't tend to talk to each other. In the Jewish community, you see, there tends to be more of a focus on the history and on the violence. And I think all of us can remember the first and the second Intifada, when school buses were being blown up and people were afraid to send their children to school. The reality of the violence in that community in Israel, coming from the Arab side at the time, was quite overwhelming. I'll tell a very quick story of a trip in which we met with with some rabbis called Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel, with a number of pastors from this city. And one of the pastors asked the Rabbis for Human Rights, is a very left-wing group in Israel, very critical of the government of Israel, and asked, how do you feel about the separation wall that exists in Israel? Thinking that he would be horrified by it. And I always remember this because the surprising response that he gave is that they supported it. And so the pastor asked, well, how could that be something that you would support? And he said, because the harsh reality is that it saves lives. My children can get on a bus and go to school, and it saves Arab lives as well. So these kinds of shocking kind of revelations, I think when you tend to see things through your own lens, living in Philadelphia in the suburbs, and then you're presented with a story like that, it's quite overwhelming. You see this as well, and this may be a class for you to be teaching, and it's not really my realm, but we say in the Jewish community discussion should focus on truth and historical fact. We place a high value on justice. In the Protestant community, we find that language should focus on peace and forgiveness. Justice means alleviating the suffering of the weak. Occupation, which is a huge buzzword, of course, denies freedom and is always wrong. So these are the kinds of conversations that we are having inside of our own communities, and they often are very difficult to reconcile. Even more closer to my heart, and even more confusing, are the dueling camps inside the Jewish community. There, again, just to add another layer of complexity, it's very divided in the Jewish community. I guess we're all used to divisions in politics these days. Why should our community be any different? But as you can see, for instance, I call them philosophers. I don't call them the right and the left, because I don't think that that's an accurate depiction of who is in each of these camps. I know many liberals who are hawks, okay? I know many conservatives who believe that the occupation is a terrible thing. So it's very confusing. But fighting delegitimization by reaching a peace agreement and stop settlement building. The human rights people on that side of the coin believe that the occupation is a corrosive cancer in Israel. The advocacy security camp, as I call them, the guardians, peace will come through a militarily strong Israel, and when Palestinians renounce violence. Israel has a biblical right to the land. I've met with some of those people who believe in the biblical right to the land. Let's just say they're not like you or I. It's a very strong-willed and dedicated group of people, and the fact of the matter is that Israel has controlled that element in Israel for decades, but unfortunately they have risen to power, not unlike what we're seeing in other countries around the world, that there's a resurgence of the right. As you can see, I just want to point out at the bottom here, the two differences in our Jewish community. The world Jewry and international community should be involved in the peace process. That's all of you. On the other side, critics are generally anti-Semitic. So in other words, you say something that's critical of Israel, this crowd automatically assumes you must be motivated by anti-Semitism. It's a big problem. And our only way of responding to each and every crisis is to circle the wagons. I personally, on the side, believe that that is absolutely counterproductive. One of the big debates that's also come out today, and this is more of a modern conversation, is one state or two. Two-state solution, which you hear mentioned often, it really is where the majority of people who are interested in peace stand, even in whether it's let's go guardians, even in the guardian camp. The feeling is that this is, as I say, these two people need a divorce, not an agreement. They need to get out of each other's way. That's the only way that this will work. It also It is something that the Palestinians want. They want a right of self-determination, and Israel wants this because to have otherwise would be the end of a Jewish state. Having said that, the one-state solution, although a minority of voices, I would not feel comfortable not raising it in this audience, because I think that there are those on the left who believe that the facts in the ground make it impossible for a two-state solution to be created. As you see here, there are, well, the number varies, but there's over 600,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank. So whether or not a two-state solution is viable, others will argue, well, look, in other places, Israel has made peace deals, moved people out. They did it. They moved out of Gaza. They've moved out of the north, and they could do it again. Others feel that that's more and more unrealistic. The settlements, how they're divided up, who's where, what's realistic to move is a very complex issue. The reality is that there are settlements and there are settlements. There are settlements that are meant to provoke. That are being built that are meant to provoke. There are settlements that really are now just seen by many Israelis as suburbs of Jerusalem or other and whether those are actually going to end up being dismantled is anybody's guess. Anyhow, this is the argument that's now taking place. Now the right and the left on the one state also differ. The left and Palestinians, they favor a single democratic state. Now, what would that mean? A single democratic state in Israel would mean the end of Israel as a Jewish state. And obviously, Yossi Klein Halevi will do a far greater job than I, the articulate spokesperson that he is, and as an Israeli, talking about why Israel not being a Jewish state could be a catastrophe. Now, the right favors annexing the West Bank. You heard a lot about that in the last year or so, especially with support of the last administration in this country. And now, there are those of us that resist that kind of attempt to just simply declare the West Bank part of Israel, because that would then mean that Israel is still considering itself a Jewish state, still has control over all of these Arabs, and then the accusations of Israel's becoming more and more like an apartheid state start to take credence. Just remember that the West Bank is not part of Israel. So Israel still can make the claim that the Arabs that live in Israel, some 20% of the population, have legitimate rights. They serve in the Knesset and government. I'm going to skip this for now. Yeah, so you see, this is some of the key outstanding issues that continue, because we're going to run out of time. Is Israel an apartheid state? And as I was saying, I think 20% of the population, but Arabs in Israel vote. The case is, of course, much worse in the West Bank, and it's outrageous what happens there. But the argument again is there have been plenty of opportunities for Arabs to extricate themselves from that situation, but it doesn't mean that Israel can't do more to alleviate the suffering. I think Yossi will tell the story, if I recall, that he was, as a soldier, he is a soldier in doing duty in the West Bank, and the reaction of his son, who is now a soldier in the West Bank, is different. That the tolerance of the Israeli public for in their side, in their perception, the intransigence of the Arab world has done great damage to the soul of that country. That there's far less tolerance for it. It either manifests itself in anger or in indifference. In other words, so you see an attempt to just sort of accept the status quo. Not much is really being done. You haven't really seen much effort made to move the peace process forward. I wanted to talk about the right of return because I think this is another very important issue in just a few minutes that we have left. You hear the right of return comes up often. The debate in Israel over the last number of decades is what happened to Arabs when Jews moved in during the War of Independence, as I mentioned earlier. And the fact of the matter is that as sanitized as it probably was in my education growing up, that many Arab communities, villages, were moved out of a mainline Israel. And it's a shameful piece of Israeli history, but it also reminds me of the terrible things that happened during war. And there are books this thick written about what happened to the Arab community during the War of Independence. So the point, though, is that the right of return, the idea that Palestinians would return to their original homes, has become one of these. I guess it's a statement that without realism. It's a deal breaker. As I say, promoting the right of return ultimately is an obstacle to peace. And as I say, it's the political equivalent of Israelis continuing to build settlements. For Israelis who believe in a biblical Israel and believe that they have a right to build settlements in any part of Israel, that's also become a deal breaker. And the only way to break this impasse is that these two, I guess, more extreme groups on both sides have to give something up. And it's an equivalency that I think is a problem. Just one comment about settlements. I think that there's an attempt. I think there's often, having said that, I think there's often we should recognize the existential nature of the conflict. Settlements, for most of us today, for many people believe that that's the obstacle to peace. But let's just remember that a state was offered to the Palestinian community before there was any such thing as a settlement. The settlements didn't come until after the 1967 war. By that time, there were at least two offers of a state on the table, and settlements started to be built after that time as Israel took control of the West Bank. That is not an excuse, though, for the building of settlements. Just because Israel has certain rights to parts of those lands, and those will probably be negotiated, doesn't give them the right to build indiscriminately in the West Bank, which is the expressed intention is clearly to make, I think, a two-state solution impossible. So what should we do? How can we all help? To me, this was the essence of what I talked about as a director of community relations and what we talked about on our trips to Israel. There is a tendency for us, I don't care what it is, I don't care what the political issue is, I don't care if it's your favorite football team or your baseball team, there's a tendency for us to look at one side and say, there's the team we believe in, there's the team we support. And I think that if it's at all possible for us to understand that our team here is peace, and we have to understand that Israelis and Arabs live in fear. It is not one side versus the other. So asking groups like yourselves who are clearly interested and want to be supportive of the peace process, I urge us all to learn what it means to be supportive of Israel and the Arabs, supportive of Israelis and Palestinians. We can do both. I frankly find it even harder, what I just said, to promote in the Jewish community. We are so used to circling the wagons after all of these years of persecution, not to mention culmination in the Holocaust, that I think we have too many of us have forgot how important it is to express empathy for another side. And the reality is that there are many, many organizations in Israel that are working very hard to get Arabs and Jews together. Many. I mean, in fact, I just want to this organization is just one, but it's called the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and they have over 100 organizations where Arabs and Jews work together. I go back to something I said earlier about what you might see in television and newspapers, but it's all just conflict, and it's all just fighting. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, there are just tons of organizations trying to bridge the gaps and build trust. I often believe, and this is some of the work that I'm doing now, that we will be able to bridge those gaps from the bottom up. We'll be able to teach people how to live with one another. If we wait for our governments to do it, Palestinian or Israeli, we'll be waiting a long time. So again, a 15-week college survey course in 50 minutes. I wanted to leave 10 minutes. I'm assuming your schedule is tight. I wanted to leave a few minutes. If there's any questions that I could answer for anybody, I'd be happy to do so. Yes?
One slide talked about how the Arabs in Israel have equal civil rights, but my understanding is that they've got like a lot less support for schools, hospitals. I mean, that they aren't completely equal.
Yes. I would say, I try to understand these things in the way, I do a lot of work in the African American community as well, and I try to understand it in somewhat of the same way. The answer is absolutely. I think that there are great inequalities, and how you extricate that, I think, is a problem. Some of it is based on what Arabs themselves want. For instance, whether they learn Hebrew, and they don't. Some want to learn Hebrew because they want to integrate. Many do not. So if you don't learn Hebrew, can you integrate into the larger society? But as far as the amount of money that goes to social services in Arab villages and whatnot, I think it's a huge problem. But I tend to understand it. You should also know at the same time that they have regress. They can take Jews to court. I mean, there are those outlets that exist. I don't want to. It's dangerous to make analogies between two worlds, two communities. But there's this. I think that if you're talking to an African American community in this country, you would hear many of the same things. And it's outrageous, and we shouldn't allow it to happen, and we need to end it. And the same is true for Israel. Yes?
The recent election in Israel, to get a majority government, they had to combine many, many parties enough to get a majority. And you've got many, many avenues of thought and direction in this government. Do you see any possibility of any progress being made because of all the different
Let me say this. I don't think I could do this type of work, even as a volunteer, if I didn't think that there would be there's a chance for progress. I want to just tell you a story that when the passion that exists for peace in Israel, I remember that when Anwar Sadat went to, after fighting Israel in the 73 war, went to Israel and spoke before the Knesset. There were parades in the streets, parades. People, it was a national holiday. People came out and were so passionate about the desire for peace. I think that's a long time ago. And we have seen progress. We have seen normalization with a number of Arab countries now. The Abraham Accords, which took place just recently. So I think that the wall is melting, so to speak. Whether or not the Israeli government can get behind that. I just don't know. I think that right now we have seen a shift in politics, passion. Really, the right it has primacy over the conversation. The good news is that, interestingly enough, Naftali Bennett, who is very conservative, also I think is much more of a pragmatist. And I think that this coalition government that they've managed to put together, I am optimistic that we are going to see some progress made. But it remains to be seen, because it's not just about the Israelis making progress. The Palestinians have to do more to meet the Israelis halfway, and this has been a problem, for decades. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm just thinking on the Palestinian side, it's political gridlock right now. I mean, they've got a boss who's not really legitimate anymore.
Right.
So it seems like a similar situation where, I would hope for some change of leadership on that side that will bring new thoughts and new, ways of operating to the table.
Yeah, I think that here's an area that I'm not going to. I don't know enough about. I do know this. I do know that the Palestinians are not quite sure who their next leader is going to be. Abbas is an older man. And I think that a lot of people are concerned about that. There is right now a huge stalemate, really the peace process, and I put that in quotes because I've been hearing about the peace process since I'm 13 years old. The peace process has really been on hold for 5 or 6 years. I mean, I would say that the last offer of peace through the Trump administration was not taken very seriously by a lot of people on the ground for a lot of reasons. But whether or not the Palestinians are in a position to be able to make peace, Hamas is very strong. Hezbollah is supported by the Iranians. There are too many people in positions of leadership who are diametrically opposed to making peace. It just runs counter to everything that they stand for. This is why I'm an advocate, and many people are an advocate for building up the center. The center, through these organizations that I showed before, especially coming from the outside, people like yourselves who are able to understand that there are both sides hurting and both sides need support. For instance, I didn't show the slide on BDS. You've heard of the boycott, divestment, sanctions. To me, the boycott, divestment, sanctions is a terrible, it's complete, it has exactly the opposite effect on what it was intended to do. There are too many people, well-intentioned, to say, oh, well, that's just like South Africa. No, it's not like South Africa. It's not the same thing. And what it does is it takes a very paranoid community, a community in Israel that grew up mostly in the shadow of the Holocaust, and they look at BDS and their reaction is, well, there they go again. There go the anti-Semites. They're after us again. And it does. And besides the fact that it does nothing economically for anybody, and I've had in some of our missions, we've had Palestinian Arabs who say that. When they say that it's just BDS is just something that makes people feel good in the United States. It does nothing for us. Very interesting. So I'm not optimistic, and I think people feel like right now we are stalled. We are stalled. Do we have time for one more? Last question. Yes, sir.
Is it possible for some middle-of-the-road politicians to become Prime Minister of Israel? Somebody who sort of has your attitude politically?
I think, listen, I think that the bad news is that people argue that the left is dead in Israel right now. I think left politically. I think there are plenty of progressives in Israel, It's just that they are, I don't know that there's, I don't know, I think that my sense is, I don't want to sound sort of one-sided or biased when I say this, But I think that the Israeli public needs a sign. They need a sign. They need an Anwar Sadat sign. And I personally believe, this is a personal belief, I personally believe that another Anwar Sadat emerges in the Palestinian community, and the Israelis, the right will get trampled, trampled by the progressives rushing to try to make peace with Palestinians. In fact, some people feel that we should do that already with a one-state solution. It's a very complicated formulation. Give up on the Jewish state, give up on the idea of a Jewish state, and simply create a democratic state of Israel. And, not have a majority faith or religion, and just move forward that way. But yes, I think there are plenty of people, and I think that right now is probably not the time. But even in this coalition government, there are voices. It's voices from the left, and that's really what this coalition government is about. So I would be optimistic from that standpoint. But it's a delicate balancing act. Where does that sound? Does that sound familiar? It's happening in our own country. We focus on one or two Congress people who have all this kind of leverage, because why do they have all this kind of leverage? We talk about the squad. The squad has leverage because the balance of power is so equal. If this were a healthier democracy, we wouldn't hear so much about them. I'm looking at your clock. I'm here all afternoon. I only have to be home to watch a football game. So,
Adam, thank you for being with us in this space. Thank you all for coming. I invite you to chat with him if you'd like.
Sure.
After. He said he's going to be here all week, so
yeah.
The week is young. Joshua,
You said the PDF is on the website,
the PDF of this presentation is on the website. Yep.
so people are interested in checking that out.
Yep. Correct. Yep, you can find the PDF there. Adam, thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you
My
all.
pleasure. Despite technical difficulties, we still.
Hey, we got to figure it out, right?
Yeah, we did. You make a great IT person.
Oh gosh.
No, it's okay.
As soon as it disappeared,